It's a question for the entire panel, so listen carefully. There's a lot here. Part of the psychosocial stress from spills is caused by the fact that the public doesn't understand or acknowledge the trade-offs in a fuel-dependent society. They don't understand what Fran Ulmer said, that no matter what technical advancements are made, once a spill occurs, it's simply not possible to completely remove oil from the environment. Why are we so hesitant to set this expectation from the outset of a spill or even before they occur? By not establishing this fact up front, we only perpetuate the myth for the media and the public that we can respond to the oil spill in such a way that the environment will be returned to its pre-spill state to assure that any response efforts will fall short of expectations. So that kind of sets the background, the baseline, as it were, for failed expectations. Anyone want to?
One thing that
Lift it up.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. Of all those things that were written, the one thing that struck me was returning back, and we've used, this panel's used, and I've heard it used before, the term resilience. And the one thing that I've learned going around the Gulf as part of this, the Academy's research program, is that communities don't want to return to where they were. So the question to me is not, can we have an incident or a spill or a hurricane? Can we have some sort of disaster and return back to where they were, they being that community, or do we want to bounce forward? We talk about, if you look at some of the definitions of resilience, it's about bouncing back. People in the Gulf of Mexico don't want to bounce back, they want to bounce forward. So, I can't answer that person's question, but somewhere in that question was the notion of returning back to where we were, and that's, whether it's triggered by a spill or not, I think the Gulf will ultimately be a better place, not because there was all the oil gushing into the Gulf of Mexico because of a man-made problem, but because of the attention that's now given to the Gulf of Mexico in a lot of different areas, not only from research, but other restoration, other areas. So, it's hard for me to say this. It's not hard for me to say it, but it's. I wouldn't have said it a few years ago. Can the Gulf of Mexico be better than it was in 2010? And I think the answer is yes.
I'll try to give some response. I think one thing to consider is, particularly in the Exxon Valdez, they do understand that this is an oil economy. It's not something that they reject. They use oil just like everybody else. But they also accept a tremendous amount of risk without a whole lot of gain, other than they're part of the oil economy. And so the risk of tankers running through their fishing grounds, when there were alternatives, and these alternatives were discussed before TAPS came into play, we're forcing them to accept a great deal of risk, and then to throw up your hands and say, well, what's your problem? You're part of the oil economy, is doing them a disservice. They again, are accepting, are exposed to these risks, and they didn't necessarily volunteer to take them on.
So I think that a lot of this has to do with risk communication, and that goes back to our regulatory environment and the statutes. We start out with a project, we do an environmental impact statement, which typically comes up and says, oh, the risk of an oil spill is very low. It's 1 in 200 years, and that number is not well understood by the public. And but we put it out there because we want to do that project. We want to advance that, and basically we do the project. Then we develop contingency plans, and the contingency plan standards is that you've got to be able to pick up the oil, and in order to get this contingency plan, you've got to attest that you can pick up the oil. So the industry has no choice whatsoever than to say that they can pick up the oil. And all of these things are essentially communicating, if not falsehoods, at least a misperception to the public, and therefore, how can you blame them for being outraged when things don't work out quite that way?
Anyone else? Okay. I'm going to move on to a question about peer listening. There were actually several about peer listening, so maybe Dwayne and LaDon are going to be the recipients of this. There was a perception that based on the results that happened in Cordova and Alabama, that peer listening didn't really work. So I guess here are the questions. Does this mean that the peer listening approach should be something different in light of media exposure? Is the place at the table before and peer listening after enough? Is there an ongoing study beyond the peer listening effort to determine how to reduce public stress when an oil spill incident happens?
It's a great question. As a performance-based program, I ask my staff that all the time. So what? You did this, so what? What I hope these folks understand that Sea Grant, like a lot of other programs, were throwing a lot of things on the wall hoping they would stick. You know, it's kind of like I've heard Chuck Wilson say, laying the track down as the train's running. I think that applies to a lot of things you saw in 2010. You know, the peer listening program is something, if you'd sit down and design that program, would have taken a year to design and develop, 3 years to execute, 1 or 2 years to evaluate. We did with about $20,000. Most of that went to Steve PQ and production costs for that. So I can't say if was effective or not. I can say that I think it's worth assessing and evaluating. I mean, implementing and evaluating. We took the program to Tuscaloosa and Birmingham after I think it was 2012 tornadoes, and worked with a lot of church groups. You know, I guess if you look at suicides as a metric, you could say it was pretty damn effective. So, but there's no correlation to that. But, you know, I'd like to think it was effective. I can tell you this, it didn't hurt. People became better listeners and compassionate listeners, and I think I need to take a refresher course in that about every 3 months. I think we all would benefit from doing that. So, yeah, for the amount of money that we had to invest in that program, I thought it was very successful. Do I think it's useful in the future for other disasters? You know, I think it would be, but that's what I think. I think it needs to be documented.
I'm not sure that our data was an adequate test of how effective the program was. You might think of how much worse would it have been had the program not been in place. Again, you have a different population, a very broad population, different ethnic groups compared to Cordova, Alaska. So I'm not sure, even though this very crude measure shows that there wasn't a big decline in the amount of people in the severe category, I still think it has potential and shouldn't be cast aside simply because of this one metric or one measure.
Okay, well, I have a more provocative question then for you that somebody submitted, and it refers to a note from Dr. Piku, who said that in Cordova, that the community recovered really only after the death and departure of people who remembered the spill. So the question is, does the ongoing psychological support really help, or is it just a Band-Aid?
A Band-Aid is a help.
Yeah,
Well, all right. Let me finish then. The question, in other words, the real solution would be to change the system that is creating the stress. litigation power of distant people, et cetera, rather than helping people get through an impossible situation?
I would like to live in that world,
Yeah.
where you could change the system where you would guarantee there would never be another disaster.
Amen.
And if I can't live in that world, then I'm going to be prepared for what might happen. And I think a program like peer listening is one way to be prepared, and being prepared makes you more resilient.
I'll take it a step further. I would like to see, I know everybody has a lot going on when you're responding to a spill, but I'd like to see members of the response community take this peer listener program. And maybe it would help them understand public outrage and respond in a way that doesn't add fuel to the fire. I don't think you're going to find a situation, an ideal situation, change the system where you're not going to have any frustration, any mental health problems after a disaster. That happens. That's part of what goes on. That's why it's called a disaster, is you have these kinds of impacts. So I'm not ready to throw it away at all.
I'll give you a little story to back that up. I do agree. I think the incident command folks were under enormous amount of stress and pressure, and I empathize with them a great deal. So I do think that and maybe they did. I know there are a lot of things done for those folks that they deserved. I don't know if availability of counseling was one of those. It should have been. I'm sure it was. But I can tell you this: we asked the oil and gas industry to participate in one training in Foley, Alabama. And obviously we're looking for a little bit of financial support to perpetuate this. And someone from the industry came and invited by a leader in that community, and after the person left early. And ultimately, it was so upsetting the way that workshop was upsetting to her, because it was placing blame on the oil and gas industry, that she told me that she literally had to stop and throw up alongside the road. Lucy, we got a problem when you have that sort of division between those people, those victims that are the result, like in Cordova or Orange Beach, Alabama, and the folks in charge. That we can't have a discussion where we see all sides of that, and recognize it and then address it.
Okay, I'm going to move on to, I'm going to try to lift this up a little bit. I'm going to move on to the subject of community involvement, and this really will involve Tim, and I think to some extent LaDon. So here's the question. The importance of involving local community members in planning for and decisions regarding responding to oil spills has been recommended. How is this best accomplished? Most have full-time jobs, et cetera, and are not available for exercises or planning meetings. Difficult to involve lay people up front. And another related question, during a spill or other disaster, how can the community be given more control over their fate? And then perhaps even a related question, especially for Alaska, how do you make sure that Alaska tribal corporations and communities are involved?
That's a lot of questions, but I think the RCACs are a way of engaging communities and bringing representatives of a community into the discussion about oil and gas production and transportation. They're two very different programs that are regional citizens advisory councils in Alaska. They're almost night and day difference, but the intent, the purpose, I think, is served, that somebody that's interested within the community goes to a forum and discusses the issues at hand, and then brings that information back to the community and brings that community's input to the process. So I think that's one very good way to do it. We mentioned yesterday the SERV's fishing vessel program. I talked today a little bit about the SOS team. I think training people in the community. We have local volunteer fire departments, so why can't we have local volunteer spill response organizations and give some people some skills and some understanding of what you can and can't do with oil spill response. Let somebody go actually try to deploy boom and stop a simulated spill, see what's really involved in that, and so you understand the complexities of it. I think that's ways to do it. I mentioned, you know, peer community to peer community interaction, and I think that's a real important thing, because I think communities that have been impacted by spills or any kind of disaster have much more credibility with other communities than some outside expert coming to town.
LaDon, you have anything to add to that, or?
Could you repeat the question? My mind was drifting. I'm off task and 54, all those things.
It was basically encouraging involvement of local community members in either response planning or the response itself.
Well, in the Gulf and where you have tropical events, things unfold differently than an oil spill. And I think there was this expectation that, you know, local MAs would be heavily involved, and maybe not heavily involved, or at least somewhat involved, like they were with hurricanes. So, you know, there were these, and I view those as local communities. Local MA managers are the boots on the ground for disasters in communities. And for them not to be fully engaged, I think was probably a surprise at the beginning, but I think, I understand, there's legal precedent for the way things operated. Could it be improved? Yeah. I think we all recognize that. You know, from that, so that's one group of folks. You know, I think that the environmental NGOs were heavily involved in a lot of things. I think other groups, you know, NOAA partners, EPA partners, like the NEPs or Sea Grants or Land Grants Cooperative Extension or those programs, you know, they're nimble and adaptable, and they are involved, and they do things like some of the things I described earlier. So, yeah, communities need to be involved, and they need to be involved.
Bob?
My perspective on this, I guess I picked up from doing dockside chats and town halls. I'm a resident, I was a resident of Dauphin Island, Alabama, lived there for 28 years, so I consider myself part of the community that was impacted. In the going around and visiting with different groups, 9 different locations across the impact zone of the Gulf, Northern Gulf, and in town halls in downtown Mobile, and answering questions with a number of experts from different agencies. One of the things that we ran into quite frequently was it was a trust issue. Even though I was a local resident, I worked for the Fed. And so we ran into, for example, the Charter Captains Group, the president of the Charter Captains Group. I was sitting there with an EPA colleague and myself, and we were trying to explain exactly what we were doing it and why we were doing it this way. And there was a scowl on his face, and we asked, I said, do you have any questions? I mean, and he says, came right out and says, we don't trust you. I don't believe you. And I don't know how you get past that. I mean, there was a saying going around between NOAA and FDA and EPA at the time, as we were starting to put the data together, that we can't truth ourselves out of this. And I don't know what the appropriate social mechanism to bridge the gap is. But in certain respects, I understand the need or the desire for community members to be involved in a decision-making process, but in certain instances, they don't have the training, they don't have the time to get the training. Certainly observation is a great idea, but there are elected officials and representatives within the state. You know, the departments of public health at the state and local levels are there. These are people that local communities voted on. I mean, so it's all part of the process. I understand communication needs to be improved. That was a downfall of a lot of the federal agencies. More frequently, more thoroughly, someone that has the talent to communicate across different audiences is a very important factor. But this is a very complicated picture, and I'm not sure that, and it's also muddled by the fact that there was a substantial amount of malingering going on. So you don't know what's real, what's not. It's and as a person that was involved in the response and putting together and relaying the data and trying to get the information out and trying to convince people and confirm or to belay their fears in certain instances, it was tough sledding. Even with the data, even trying to communicate the data in different ways, the different nuances of the science, like the the dispersant toxin issue, oil issue. It's a tough challenge, and I think more emphasis needs to be put on, okay, how do you communicate, and maybe there's a way we can bridge that gap in some way. I'm not sure. I'm more of a scientist than a sociologist. I get in trouble all the time opening my mouth, so it's...
Richard, you had something?
No, yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, we've noticed that as well. You can't just, drop in, at the last minute and be like, I'm here to save the day. I have as a scientist, I have all this data, and here's how it's going to work, and just kind of, from up on high, implement this. I mean, I think it really takes a lot of work to establish the relationships with the community groups, with key stakeholders in the community, to build trust, to educate them, to understand what their needs are. It's a two-way dialogue, and it really points to having these networks set up in advance. So you can't just, just drop in at the last minute, in a disaster scenario when people have all these other competing interests pulling for their time, to all of a sudden then establish and figure out who are the trustworthy sources, who are the stakeholders, who are the key representatives of the stakeholders that are impacted. And so we're trying to do that, with this DR2 framework, to establish these networks, to have it in place nationwide, with our children's centers, with our Superfund centers, to have these community engagement cores, to try to address that, because you're right, it's very, very difficult to that, even if you're coming in from a scientific standpoint where you're just like, the data are what they are. It's not that difficult, but I think people have different interpretations that you have to understand.
I think there's a broader issue here in that in our society, we increasingly distrust science because it doesn't match what we want it to say. If you look at, for example, climate change science, there's all these deniers out there, and you can pick that up in the media and you can run with it and bash science. Therefore, science kind of comes into play not having a good reputation, being distrusted, because you're supporting somebody's interest and maybe gouging somebody else's interest. And so our society has kind of this inherent, I don't know if it's inherent, but it's certainly rampant right now, a distrust of science if it doesn't match your belief system. And so I've had people say, I don't believe in climate change. Well, it's not a question of belief, it's a question of scientific fact, but they don't want to hear that. They don't want to change their lifestyle. They don't want to make the changes that climate science would suggest that would have to be made. So you have lots of personal, economic interest, political interest, which muddies up the water and creates this kind of milieu of distrust if you're not supporting my cause.
Tim, I don't want to cut you off, but I want to get to two more questions in a lightning round because we're running out of time here before lunch. But I just wanted to get Bob to answer this question. How can it be that the fish safety sampling is so simple and straightforward that the message got so garbled? So 1 minute, Bob.
1 minute, 1 minute, okay. Is this on? Yeah. It was, oil spills are visual, visceral events. They are ugly. This one was ugly. And there was a sense of disbelief from the get-go. I talked about these town hall meetings that I attended very early on when the oil was still coming out of the wellhead. And we had crowds of hundreds of people in the convention center downtown Mobile. And they were very, very upset. Fishermen, coastal residents, residents in Mobile. And I don't think it was very difficult to communicate and to reassure them that no, that the Gulf is not dying. It's not going to die, because that was repeated time over time. The Gulf is dead. I think it was just a matter of that. There was a sense of a suspension of belief in everything at the time. We had a suicide. I knew people that refused to shave until the Gulf came back. I mean, and they had beers. And so I don't know that I'm responding to the question adequately. As Richard said, the data is the data. Being able to communicate it in a way that's understood is a talent. Apparently, we didn't have it. We tried in many different ways. We visited the Gulf Coast with the commissioner. I was on the dockside tour, all of that, and tried to communicate this. And we even had Alton Brown come down, of all people, the Iron Chef. I mean. We made the effort to communicate and to convince people that, look, that this is real data. I mean, and we can show factually that this is the way it is. But there were many interests. They were divided interests, and about 50% of the fishing community was wanted to get back to work. The other 50% maybe didn't. I don't know. That's part of the challenge.
Okay, thank you. And Nancy, can I ask one more question? All right. This is for Richard, and it actually is a leftover question that I want to just set him up. It's sort of a rhetorical question, and the question has to do with whether the 1,500 workers that are under contract up in Alaska to respond to a spill have any sort of a biomonitoring program to establish a health benchmark. And I don't know that we can answer that up here, but I wanted to set you up to sort of make that pitch and communicate it to the response community as something that we might consider in the future.
Oh, yeah. So as I mentioned during my talk, we had a lot of difficulty contacting, first off, these individuals, and then once we did contact these individuals, getting baseline data from them. And so I think it would be a good opportunity to, if you have these established VU programs, in Prince William Sound, to, conduct a baseline health assessment of these individuals, so that at least should a spill occur in the future, you would have this baseline information. I think this ties into the Oil Spill Commission text that following Deepwater Horizon, that the National Response Framework has a human health component in it, but the OPRA and the National Contingency Plan doesn't have that. So we need to add a human health component into that, so that we can then look into longitudinal human health effects moving forward. But unfortunately, that
requires
some regulatory approval. So I don't know if
okay,
that's
but
well
that's
above
food
my
for
pay
thought. I just wanted to leave us with that and get us to lunch. So thank you very much, panel. I thought that was great.
grade. Thank you.